The anomaly hung in space like a wound in reality, a swirling mass of fractured light and pulsing darkness. The crew of the USS Horizon stared in silence as the display screens filled with its image. Energy readings spiked erratically, defying known physics. The distortion bent the surrounding starlight, twisting the void into something alive. Captain Elias Mercer leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as the numbers scrolled across the screen. He felt the unease thick in the air, an unspoken tension that grew with every second they lingered. The ship's engines hummed beneath their feet, a fragile tether to familiarity in the face of the unknown. "Analysis, Doctor." "Chen," Mercer ordered, his voice calm but sharp. Chief Science Officer Dr. Mara Chen adjusted her glasses and ran her fingers over the sensor panel. Her usually steady hands trembled slightly. "It's not a wormhole, at least not one we've ever seen. There's temporal flux, a lot of it. Time dilation is spiking off the charts. Whatever this is, it's collapsing and expanding simultaneously." Lieutenant Claire Voss, the weapons officer, folded her arms, her face set in a skeptical grimace. "Temporal anomalies rarely end well in the stories, Captain. This thing's screaming 'stay away' loud and clear." Mercer's gaze remained locked on the anomaly. He understood the risks, but the opportunity was undeniable. Discoveries like this could reshape humanity's understanding of the universe or destroy them. The soft hiss of the ship's ventilation was the only sound as he weighed his decision. "We've come too far to turn back now," Mercer said at last. "Prepare to breach the event horizon. I want full sensor sweeps and contingency protocols in place. If things go south, we pull out immediately." A murmur of acknowledgement passed through the bridge, though unease lingered in every face. Dr. Chen hesitated before meeting his gaze. "Sir, once we cross that threshold, we may not be able to come back." Mercer gave her a small nod. "Understood, but if we don't, we'll never know what's on the other side." The horizon tilted toward the anomaly, its engines surging as it adjusted course. The swirling void grew in the viewport until it filled their vision, an all-consuming storm of fractured time and space. The ship trembled as they crossed the boundary. The moment they breached the anomaly, reality unraveled. A soundless scream tore through their minds as the ship was engulfed in shimmering waves of distortion. The lights on the bridge flickered and died, replaced by a suffocating darkness. Time splintered around them. Mercer's heartbeat seemed to slow to a crawl, while moments ahead and behind blurred into fleeting echoes. Mercer clutched the armrest as a pressure like an invisible hand pushed down on his chest. Across the bridge, Voss doubled over, gasping for air as if the weight of the universe had settled over her lungs. Dr. Chen fell to her knees, her eyes wide with terror as disjointed visions flashed across her mind. A burning city, an endless battlefield of twisted bodies, and her own reflection staring back, altered in ways that defied sanity. "Status report." Mercer's voice was hoarse, nearly drowned out by the rising hum of something vast and ancient. Reed, the ship's engineer, shouted from his station as sparks erupted around him. "Systems are fluctuating. Navigation's down. Powers. Damn it. The whole grid's losing cohesion." The hull groaned like a living thing as if resisting their passage. The ship buckled, and for one dreadful moment, Mercer thought they would be torn apart. But then, as suddenly as it began, the turbulence stopped. The anomaly released its grip, and the horizon drifted into eerie stillness. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside the viewport, the swirling storm of light was gone, replaced by the vast expanse of stars. But they were wrong. The constellations had shifted, subtly at first, but enough to make Mercer's stomach twist. "Where are we?" Voss whispered, her voice strained. Dr. Chen pulled herself to her feet, glancing at the readings. Her face paled. This isn't our sector. The star patterns don't match. I don't think we're just in a different part of space." She hesitated, then added grimly, "I think we've crossed time." The implications settled over the crew like a shroud. Mercer's mind raced. It wasn't possible, not like this. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The displays flashed erratic readings, showing strange energy surges and distortions. Then the transmission came. It crackled through the speakers, low and distorted, a sequence of indecipherable syllables in a voice that seemed both alien and eerily human. The crew froze as the whispering hum filled the bridge. The words felt wrong, as if they were being spoken inside their minds, bypassing the need for sound entirely. Reed swore under his breath and tried to cut the signal. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Chen murmured, staring at the audio waves. "It's old. Incredibly old." Mercer leaned closer to the comm station. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Is it a distress call?" "No," Chen said. Her face was unreadable, but her voice was laced with quiet dread. "It's an invitation." Before Mercer could respond, the ship's proximity alarms blared. A new shape appeared on the radar, faint, almost undetectable. It wasn't another ship. It was massive, irregular, and organic in structure. Slowly, it drifted into view, a vast, hulking mass of carapace and sinew, coiled like a predator in the void. Rows of glistening spines protruded from its surface, and beneath its translucent shell, something moved, twitching limbs, malformed and writhing as if made from the scraps of countless species. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed a sickly amber, staring directly at the horizon. Chen's voice trembled. "That thing, it didn't come from here." Mercer's gut clenched as the creature opened a maw lined with jagged, chitinous appendages, revealing something pulsating within, a fleshy, pulsating orb that mirrored the anomaly's light. The whispering voice grew louder, intertwining with their own thoughts. The creature wasn't just observing them. It was reaching into their minds. "Full reverse," Mercer shouted. "Get us out of here." Reed's fingers flew over the controls. "Engines aren't responding." The ship jolted as a tendril shot out from the creature, embedding itself into the hull. The metal groaned as organic fibers spread like veins across the outer plating. Alarms blared, warning of hull breaches. The ship shuddered, locked in place. As they watched in horror, the tendril began to burrow deeper. The whispering voice coalesced into a single phrase that echoed through their minds. "You should not have come." Mercer's eyes locked with Chen's, unspoken terror passing between them. Whatever they had found wasn't a mystery waiting to be solved. It was something alive, and it was hungry. Pain, searing, disorienting pain. Lieutenant Claire Voss felt like she was being torn apart and stitched back together by unseen hands. Her vision pulsed with darkness and flashes of blinding light, fragments of images that weren't hers, or weren't yet. She gasped as the sensation of falling overtook her, though she was standing still. The cold air struck her lungs like a punch as she landed hard on a muddy battlefield. The sky above was a churning mass of dark clouds. The smell of iron and fire clung to everything. Men and women in crude armor clashed with swords and spears, their screams filling the air. The ground was slick with blood. A war, but not one Voss recognized. She scrambled to her feet, instinct overriding confusion. A horse thundered past, its rider wielding a spear aimed at her. Voss rolled to the side just in time, the weapon slicing past her face. The warrior's eyes were wild with fury, and something else. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched too tightly over his skull. His mouth was too wide, split at the corners like a jagged wound. Voss grabbed a fallen sword, its hilt unfamiliar in her hand. The rider circled back, letting out a guttural howl. He raised the spear again, but Voss was ready this time. She sidestepped, swinging the blade upward. It connected with a sickening crunch, and the rider toppled to the ground. The warrior's body convulsed, spasming unnaturally as something writhed beneath his skin. His chest split open in a spray of viscera, and a chitinous appendage emerged, slick and segmented like a centipede's leg, ending in a serrated point. Voss stumbled back, horrified as the rest of the creature tore free. It was humanoid only in silhouette, its flesh a patchwork of twisted muscle and sharp carapace. The creature hissed her name. Before she could react, the battlefield began to blur, the world folding in on itself. Voss felt the pull again, an unbearable tearing sensation as the scene dissolved. She hit the ground somewhere new. Voss staggered up, her body aching. This place was different, a dense, oppressive jungle. The canopy above was thick, letting in only dappled green-tinged light. The air was heavy and damp, filled with the hum of unseen creatures. She felt watched. "Chen," Voss called out, her voice weak. No answer, just the rustling of leaves. Then she saw them, hanging from the trees like grotesque ornaments. Cocoons. They pulsed faintly, as though something inside was breathing. She stepped closer to one, morbid curiosity overriding caution. The membrane was thin, stretched tight over the shape of a figure within. Voss's breath caught in her throat. It was Dr. Mara Chen, or something wearing her face. The features were distorted, her eyes too large, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Voss stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. The cocoon twitched, and a spider-like leg punctured the surface, followed by another. The thing that emerged was a mockery of humanity. It had Chen's face, but elongated and warped, its body segmented and glistening like wet obsidian. It skittered down the tree, its mandibles clicking as it let out a low, unnatural keening sound. "No, you're not real," Voss whispered. The creature lunged. Voss raised her sword, somehow still in her hand, and swung wildly. The blade connected, shearing off one of its legs, but the creature didn't slow. It crashed into her, knocking her to the ground. She fought desperately, driving the blade upward. The creature shrieked as the sword pierced its chest. Black ichor sprayed over Voss's face as the creature convulsed, then fell still. Voss shoved the body off her, gasping for air. Before she could recover, the jungle shimmered, reality bending again. The ground beneath her feet dissolved, and she felt herself falling through time. When the world reformed, she was no longer in the jungle. She was back aboard the Horizon. But something was wrong. The lights flickered dimly, and the familiar hum of the ship's engines was absent. The air was cold and stale. "Captain," Voss called out, her voice echoing down the empty corridors. No response. She moved cautiously, the sword still in her hand. The ship's walls were streaked with dark, vein-like growths. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. She reached out, but stopped herself before touching them. The corridor ahead stretched longer than it should have, twisting slightly. She forced herself forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. The silence pressed in on her, a suffocating presence. Then she saw him. Captain Mercer stood at the end of the hall, his back to her. Relief flooded her chest. "Captain!" He didn't respond. She quickened her pace, but as she drew closer, dread prickled her skin. His posture was wrong, too rigid. "Captain!" Mercer turned slowly. Voss froze. His face was hollowed, his skin pale and taut. His eyes were sunken, and his mouth twitched unnaturally. The veins beneath his skin pulsed with the same dark growths that covered the walls. "Voss," he rasped, his voice layered with something inhuman. She took a step back, but the ship groaned around her, the walls closing in. The tendrils slithered along the floor, coiling toward her feet. The thing that wore Mercer's face smiled, his teeth blackened and sharp. "You belong to it now." Voss turned and ran. The walls twisted, the ship folding in on itself. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she sprinted through the narrowing corridors. The doors ahead slammed shut, trapping her. She spun, pressing her back against the cold metal as the shadows at the far end of the hall shifted. The thing that had been Mercer shambled forward, its body unraveling into sinew and chitinous growths. The whispering voice filled her mind again, a chorus of the damned. "You should not have come." Voss gritted her teeth and raised the sword. If she was going to die, she would fight. The creature lunged, and everything went dark. When Voss opened her eyes again, she was drifting in silence. No ship, no jungle, no battlefield, just endless void. A familiar voice crackled in her earpiece, distorted but unmistakable. "Voss, do you read? It's Chen." Tears welled in her eyes. "Chen, I don't know where I am." "You're out of phase," Chen's voice replied, weak but urgent. "We're scattered across time. You have to hold on. We're going to find you." The void shuddered, distant stars flickering like dying embers. Something vast shifted in the dark. The Apex Morph was watching. Captain Elias Mercer awoke to silence. His body sprawled on the cold deck of the USS Horizon. His head throbbed with a dull, relentless pain. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lights casting a sickly orange hue, shadows stretching unnaturally long. He forced himself to sit up, swallowing back the nausea rising in his throat. The ship felt wrong. The hum of the engines was absent, replaced by a slow, rhythmic pulsing, as if the ship itself had developed a heartbeat. The floor beneath him vibrated slightly, in time with the pulse. Mercer tapped his comm. "Chen, Voss, anyone?" Static. He hauled himself to his feet and steadied himself against the wall. The metal felt warm, almost alive. His hand recoiled instinctively. He moved down the corridor, boots clicking softly against the floor. The familiar layout of the ship stretched before him, but everything felt distorted, as though reality itself was slightly out of tune. As he rounded a corner toward the main bridge, he froze. The bulkheads were covered in a latticework of fleshy, vein-like tendrils. They pulsed with a dark, ichorous fluid that seeped into the ship's structure. Mercer's stomach churned as he saw something worse. Embedded in the walls were shapes that resembled human forms, fused with the organic growth. Some were barely recognizable, their features melted into grotesque mockeries of life. Mercer's throat tightened as he recognized one of the faces, Isaac Reed, the ship's engineer. Reed's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, clouded and glassy. His mouth moved soundlessly before the tendrils tightened, pulling him deeper into the wall. Mercer stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. The horizon was being consumed, transformed. A distant whisper drifted through the air, faint but growing louder. "They are watching. They know." Mercer whipped around, drawing his sidearm. The corridor was empty, but the voice lingered in his mind, brushing against his thoughts like a cold hand. He pressed forward, forcing himself toward the bridge. The doors slid open with a groan, revealing the devastation inside. Consoles sparked and dark fluid pooled across the floor. The viewports showed the expanse of space outside, vast and empty, with no recognizable star patterns. Dr. Mara Chen was slumped over a console, her arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Mercer rushed to her side. "Chen!" She stirred, eyes fluttering open. Her face was pale and beads of sweat clung to her brow. "Captain, I'm here," Mercer said, gripping her shoulder. "What happened?" Chen winced as she sat up. We're in the future," she said hoarsely. "A future shaped by something we did or didn't do." Mercer's mind reeled. "Future? How far?" Chen shook her head weakly. "I don't know exactly, but this isn't just time travel. We're seeing the aftermath of something catastrophic, and it's spreading across every timeline." Mercer's gaze hardened. "The Apex Morph?" Chen nodded. "It's more than a predator, Captain. It's evolving, feeding on realities. Every time we interact with the past, we fracture the timeline, and it uses those fractures to spread." She took a ragged breath. "And it's winning." Before Mercer could respond, the proximity alarms blared, an awful, distorted sound that seemed more like a death knell than a warning. Mercer turned toward the viewport. Something massive drifted into view, a grotesque bioorganic construct, hundreds of kilometers long. Its surface writhed with movement. Closer inspection revealed the truth. The construct was made of thousands, perhaps millions, of fused bodies. Their limbs jutted out at impossible angles, their mouths open in silent agony. Chen's voice was barely a whisper. "It's a hive ship." Mercer felt the weight of the revelation press down on him. This was humanity's future, a future where the Apex Morph had consumed everything. He could feel it in the air, an oppressive presence watching from the void, feeding off their fear and despair. Suddenly, the comms crackled to life, distorted but recognizable. "Captain." It was Voss's voice, weak but alive. "Do you read me?" "Voss," Mercer shouted, gripping the console. "Where are you?" There was a long pause. Then, "I think I'm still on the ship, but not this version. The timelines, they're overlapping. I've seen things, Captain. Horrible things." Her voice broke. "It's in my head, it knows me." Mercer exchanged a look with Chen, whose expression was grim. "Hold on." Chen hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If we overload the ship's core and direct the energy back into the anomaly, it might collapse the fracture point. But it'll take everything we've got, and we won't survive it." Mercer's jaw tightened. "If we don't, there won't be anything left to save." Chen nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. She began typing furiously into the console, overriding the failsafes. The ship groaned in protest as the reactor surged with power. "Voss," Mercer said into the comm, his voice steady, "we're going to end this, one way or another." Silence. Then Voss's voice, quiet but resolute. "I'll see you on the other side, Captain." The ship trembled as the overload sequence activated. The walls around them pulsated violently, the tendrils reacting as though aware of their impending destruction. The hive ship outside began to move, its massive tendrils unfurling toward the horizon, desperate to stop them. The Apex Morph's whispering voice roared in their minds, no longer soft but a deafening chorus of rage and fear. "You cannot stop us. We are eternal." Mercer braced himself as the reactor's countdown reached its final seconds. He thought of his crew, of Voss, Reed, Chen, and all the lives that had been lost. If this was the price to set things right, so be it. The final warning flashed across the console. Core detonation imminent. Mercer closed his eyes. "For humanity," he whispered. The ship erupted in a blinding sphere of light, the energy collapsing inward, consuming the hive ship and the anomaly in a brilliant implosion. In the silence that followed, the void was empty once more. Mercer opened his eyes to find himself floating in darkness, alone, weightless. The stars shimmered faintly in the distance. Then, as if from nowhere, a faint hum surrounded him, the soft, familiar hum of a ship's engine. He blinked, disoriented, as he found himself seated in an escape pod, drifting near a familiar star system. The horizon was gone. There was no sign of the anomaly. A rescue beacon crackled to life in his communication. "This is the Courageous. We've picked up your signal, Captain Mercer. Hang tight. We're bringing you home." Mercer exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. But as the stars shifted outside the viewport, he felt a familiar itch beneath his skin, a faint, crawling sensation that wouldn't go away. He stared out into the endless dark, his heart heavy with a single unshakable thought. Some horrors don't die, they wait. Mercer's escape pod drifted in eerie silence, the small cabin lit only by the dim glow of the emergency console. His breaths came slow and shallow as the weight of everything settled over him. The lives lost, the horrors witnessed, and the quiet knowledge that the war was far from over. But for now, there was calm. A fragile, fleeting calm. The rescue ship, Courageous, appeared in the distance, its sleek form cutting through the void like a beacon of salvation. Mercer's calm crackled again. "Captain Mercer, this is Commander Hale. We've locked on to your pod and are bringing you aboard." He didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the stars, trying to reassure himself that they weren't shifting, that no shadows lurked within them. But deep down, he knew better. The pod shuddered as the docking clamps latched on, and moments later the hatch hissed open. A rush of sterile air greeted him as two medics reached inside, gently helping him out. The bright lights of the ship's hangar bay stung his eyes after so long in darkness. Commander Hale, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern but compassionate face, approached. "Captain Mercer," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "You're safe now." Safe. The word rang hollow. Mercer met Hale's gaze, exhaustion weighing down his every movement. "The others?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Hale's face fell. There was no sign of them. Mercer nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. There wouldn't be. The medics urged him toward the medical bay, but Mercer held up a hand. "Not yet. I need to make my report." Hale hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." In the conference room, the hum of the ship felt too loud. Mercer sat at the long metal table, hands folded tightly together as Hale activated the holo projector. A swirling image of the anomaly filled the room, though it was now marked as collapsed. "Start from the beginning," Hale said gently. Mercer's voice was hoarse but steady. "We found the anomaly during a standard scouting mission. It was unstable, a tear in space-time, but it wasn't a natural phenomenon." He leaned forward, his eyes dark. "It was a door, and something was on the other side." He told the story in full, how they crossed the event horizon, how they were splintered across time, and how the Apex Morph was more than just a predator. It was a force that consumed timelines, mutating and assimilating everything it touched. By the time he reached the destruction of the horizon, the room was silent. Hale stared at the projection, his face pale. "And the hive ship?" Hale asked quietly. "Destroyed," Mercer said. "At least, in that timeline." Hale straightened, trying to absorb the gravity of it all. "If what you're saying is true, Captain, then we may have only delayed it." Mercer's jaw tightened. "I know." He hesitated, the faint itch beneath his skin returning. His fingers flexed unconsciously. "That's why I need to warn Command. We can't pretend this is over." Hale nodded slowly. "We'll make sure your report reaches the highest levels." He paused, then placed a hand on Mercer's shoulder. "You saved countless lives today, Captain. Don't forget that." Mercer forced a weak smile. "I hope you're right." He stood and followed the medics to the medical bay, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. They guided him to a bed, and he let himself lie down for the first time in what felt like days. The hum of the ship faded into the background as his eyes drifted shut, but the dreams came quickly. A vast, empty void stretched before him. The stars were dim, flickering like dying embers. From the darkness, a massive shape began to emerge, a chitinous mass of writhing limbs and pale, segmented flesh. Its countless eyes stared into him, through him. The Apex Morph's voice filled his mind, deep and resonant. "We are not bound by time. You delayed us, but we will return." Mercer gasped, sitting bolt upright in the medbay, his heart hammering in his chest. Sweat poured down his face and his hands trembled. The faint itch beneath his skin was back, stronger this time. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but the feeling spread like something burrowing deeper. A medic rushed to his side. "Captain, are you all right?" Mercer nodded quickly, though the truth gnawed at him. Just a nightmare. But it wasn't. Days passed aboard the Courageous. Mercer's physical wounds healed, but the dreams never stopped. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Apex Morph, heard its whispers. It wasn't just a nightmare, it was a warning. In the quiet solitude of his quarters, Mercer sat in front of a mirror, staring at his reflection. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. He raised his hand slowly, watching as the skin on his forearm twitched. A faint, dark vein pulsed beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat. He knew what it was. The Apex Morph had left a fragment of itself behind, a seed buried deep within him. He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, feeling the slow, rhythmic pulse. He closed his eyes, his mind racing. He could feel it growing, spreading. If he did nothing, it would consume him, and eventually the crew, the fleet, everyone. The Apex Morph wasn't just a creature, it was a contagion of reality itself. Mercer stood and opened the comms. "Commander Hale," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I need you to meet me in the hangar bay and bring a security detail." Hale's response was laced with concern. "Captain, what's going on?" "Just trust me," Mercer replied. Minutes later, Hale arrived with 2 guards. Mercer stood near an open shuttle, his face unreadable. "What's this about, Captain?" Hale asked, eyeing the shuttle warily. Mercer met his gaze. "It's inside me?" Hale froze. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Mercer took a step forward, his voice steady despite the horror in his eyes. "The Apex Morph, it left something behind. If I stay here, it'll spread. You know what that means." Hale's face hardened as realization dawned. "No, there has to be another way." "There isn't," Mercer said quietly. "We both know it." For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Hale's eyes glistened with unspoken grief. Mercer stepped into the shuttle and sealed the hatch. He activated the flight systems, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. He looked out the viewport one last time, seeing Hale standing there, helpless. "Tell them," Mercer said over the comm. "Tell them to remember us, and tell them to be ready." The shuttle's engines roared to life as it launched into the void. Mercer set a course straight into the heart of a nearby uninhabited star, a final, irreversible act. The bright sphere grew larger as the shuttle accelerated. Mercer took one last breath, feeling the warmth of the star on his face. As the shuttle plunged into the inferno, the Apex Morph's voice howled in his mind. "No, you cannot escape." Mercer's lips curled into a small, defiant smile. "Watch me." In a blinding flash, the shuttle was gone, consumed by the star's light. The void was silent once more. Back aboard the Courageous, Hale stood alone in the hangar, staring out at the empty stars. The whisper of Mercer's final words echoed in his mind. "Be ready." And as the ship sailed through the endless dark, Hale whispered back, "We will be."